well, Allison read you about Christmas yesterday, which is very touching. And it's just very moving when you read about how they handled Christmas. And in a world where we think of all of us having so much, to realize how little they had at that Christmas and how joyful they made it for each other is very moving and special. And I think that's the kind of energy and spirit that Laura brings to all of her work. And I think I'm sure we'd all agree, it is one of the enduring reasons why we all love this material so much, because it's hard to feel like you're in an impossible situation when you read about the situations that Laura and her family endured and survived, and know that they came through it, and they came through it with an optimistic sense of what the future held for them, which is really inspiring. Something else that Allison brought up to me this morning is that it's National Prairie Day today, June 6th. Or actually, it's the first Saturday of June has been designated as National Prairie Day, and this went on the national list of holidays in 2016 when the Missouri Prairie Foundation, and who knew that there was such a thing as the National Prairie Foundation, but they have designated the first Saturday of June as National Prairie Day, and the mission of the National Prairie Foundation is to enhance public awareness of what prairie is, educate it about its value, and motivate all who learn about prairie to be inspired to support prairie protection, conservation, restoration, enjoyment, and the ecological concepts found there. If you find yourself in a position to, and now, I mean, our prairies used to be 160 million acres across the country. I think that the Missouri Prairie Foundation has something like 3,200 acres under management around the country, different parts of the Midwest. So it is indeed a rare thing to go and find natural untouched prairie land. There's actually a little in DeSmet at the Ingalls Homestead. I think that the Sullivans have kept, maybe a couple of acres as natural untouched prairie land. And it's hard to sort of tell it apart from the other grassland that's around it. But suffice it to say that actual prairie, untouched prairie, as Laura may have experienced it with her family, is exceedingly rare in our country now. You can drive through the Midwest hour after hour, and it's cornfields or soybeans, and you see wind turbines blowing and all the sort of thing, but you see very little untouched land. It's really, and as vast as it is, this land is being used for important purposes. But today, June 6th, we celebrate National Prairie Day. And what could be more appropriate to celebrate National Prairie Day than a reading from one of the Laura Ingalls Wilder Little House on the Prairie books, in this case, The Long Winter. So here we are together. We as a group are celebrating National Prairie Day. So good for us that we're doing this. And next time you happen to be near a prairie, think a good thought for Laura, because it's her life on that land, as minute as it is now, but it's her life on that land that inspired all of this that we love so much. So good that we're celebrating it today. We're going to pick up our reading of The Long Winter. Let me get my iPad open here with the chapter Antelope. And it's getting to be sort of exciting. This is sort of an action-packed chapter. So, here we go. There came a sunny day when the loose snow was rolling like drifts of smoke across the frozen white prairie. Pa came hurrying into the house. "There's a herd of antelope west of town," he said, as he took his shotgun down from its hooks and filled his pockets with cartridges. Laura threw Ma's shawl around her and ran into the cold front room. She scratched a peephole through the frost on the window, and she saw a crowd of men gathering in the street. Several were on horseback. Mr. Foster and Almanzo Wilder were riding the beautiful Morgan horses. Cap Garland came running and joined the men on foot who were listening to Pa. They all carried guns. They looked excited, and their voices sounded excited and loud. Now come on back where it's warm, Laura. Sorry, that's Ma's voice. Come back where it's warm, Laura, Ma called. Sorry, wrong voice. Think of venison, Laura said, hanging up the shawl. I hope Pa gets 2 antelopes. I will be glad to have some meat to go with the brown bread, Ma said, but we must not count our chickens before they are hatched. Why, Ma, Pa will get an antelope if there are any antelopes, said Laura. Carrie brought a dish of wheat to fill the hopper of the coffee mill that Mary was grinding. Roast venison, Carrie said, with gravy on potatoes and brown bread. Now, wait a minute, Mary, Laura exclaimed. Listen, there they go. The steady wind rushed by the house and whistled shrill along the eaves, but they could dimly hear the voices and the feet of the men and horses moving away along Main Street. At the end of the street, they paused. They could see a mile away across the snowdrifts and the blowing snow, the gray herd of antelope drifting southward. Slow and easy does it, said Pa. Give us time to work around them to the north before you boys close in from the south. Come in slow and herd them toward us without scaring them if you can, till they're in gunshot. When you're herding animals, it's very important. People don't realize, and when I was a kid, we used to chase horses around in fields trying to get them into a corral so we could catch them and ride them. And as a kid, it's fun to get the horses running. But, when you get an animal like that running, they're going to beat you every time. They are much faster than you are. And you're not going to be able to contain them with just a few guys, because they can just blow right around you. And this is true for virtually any four-legged animal that you would encounter on the prairie, and most certainly antelope, who could run very fast. So it's important that as you're trying to encircle them, that you're moving slowly so that the antelope aren't perceiving the movement too aggressively. And of course, ideally, you'd want to stay downwind of these antelopes so they wouldn't smell you moving around them. And people sort of joke about that, but there's absolute truth to that. They can smell you on the wind, and if you're a foreign smell, they're not used to it. It's not supposed to be there. They're going to move away from that. So anyway, moving slowly is very important. So come in slow and herd them toward us without scaring them if you can, till they're in gunshot. There's no hurry. We've got the day before us, and if we work it right, we ought to get us one apiece. Maybe we better ride to the north, and you fellows on foot surround them from the south, Mr. Foster said. No, let's go it as Ingalls said, Mr. Hawthorne said. Come on, boys. String out, Pa said, and go slow and easy. Don't scare them. On the Morgans, Almanzo and Mr. Foster took the lead. The cold wind made the horses eager to go. They pricked their ears forward and back and tossed their heads, jingling the bits and pretending to shy a little at their own shadows. They stretched their noses forward, pulling on the bits and prancing to go faster. Hold her steady, Almanzo said to Mr. Foster. Don't saw on the bit. She's tender-mouthed. So Mr. Foster, who we're going to find out in a second is not a horseman, was probably pulling on the reins and grinding the bit in Almanzo's horse's mouth. This is Lady, and one of Prince and Lady were the wonderful matched pair that he had. And you don't want to be sawing back and forth in the horse's mouth, because that just, as Almanzo describes Lady, she's tender-mouthed, which means he's broken her very carefully. So it doesn't take much pressure to get Lady to do what you want to do. if you're not someone who's accustomed to riding or driving a carriage or a wagon, you might pull more than you need to. And it really just is not a good experience for anybody. And the horse is a bit confused because they don't need that much pressure. And horses will always move away from pressure. So the more you pull, the more they're going to try and lessen that pressure. In this case, if you're pulling on them, they're going to move with that pressure to get the pressure off them. It's a sort of a, interesting, riding the horse is an interesting exercise in pressure and less pressure. And I know Martha's a horsewoman, and there may be others of you that are horse people in this, and you understand it maybe better than I'm saying it. But pressure is a big deal for horses. Mr. Foster did not know how to ride. He was nervous as Lady. He was as nervous as Lady, and he was making her more nervous. He bounced in the saddle and did not hold the reins steadily. Almanzo was sorry he let him ride Lady. Careful, Foster, Almanzo said. That mare will jump out from under you. What's the matter with her? What's the matter with her? Mr. Foster chattered in the cold wind. Oh, there they are. In the clear air, the antelopes seemed nearer than they were. Beyond the drifting herd, the men on foot were working westward. Almanzo saw Mr. Ingalls at the head of the line. In a few more minutes, they would have the herd surrounded. He turned to speak to Mr. Foster, and he saw Lady's empty saddle. At that instant, a shot deafened him, and both horses jumped high and far. Almanzo reined Prince down as Lady streaked away. Foster was jumping up and down, waving his gun and yelling, crazy with excitement. He had jumped off Lady, let go of her reins, and fired at the antelope, but they were too far away to hit. Here's the picture that Garth Williams drew of that event. You can see Foster jumping up and down, Almanzo on Prince out in front, and there's Lady in the distance galloping off towards the antelope. I mean, imagine, look out here. Yeah. Heads and tails up, the antelope were skimming away as if the wind were blowing them above the snowdrifts. Brown Lady overtook the graying herd and reached its middle, running with them. Don't shoot! Don't shoot! Almanzo yelled, though he knew that his yells were useless against the wind. The antelope were already passing through the line of men on foot, but no one fired at them for fear of hitting the mare. The glossy brown Morgan, head up, black mane and tail flying, went over a prairie swell in the midst of the gray, low cloud of antelope and vanished. In a moment, the horse and the herd passed over another white curve then. Growing smaller, they appeared again, and again the prairie swallowed them. Now, it looks like you've lost her, Wilder, Mr. Hawthorne said. That's too bad. The other riders had come up. They sat still on their horses, watching the distant prairie. The antelope herd, with Lady small and dark in it, appeared once more as a flying gray smudge that quickly vanished. Pa came and the other men on foot. Cap Garland said, "Tough luck, Wilder. Guess we might as well have risked a shot." "You're a mighty hunter before the Lord, Foster," Gerald Fuller said. "Well, he's the only man that got a shot," said Cap Garland, "and what a shot." "I'm sorry, I must have let the mare go," Mr. Foster said. "I was so excited, I just didn't think. I thought the horse would stand. I never saw an antelope before." He'd never seen an antelope before. "Next time you take a shot at one, Foster, wait till you're within range," Gerald Fuller told him. No one else said anything. Almanzo sat in the saddle while Prince fought the bit, trying to get free to follow his mate. Frightened as Lady was and racing with the herd, the danger was that she would run herself to death. Trying to catch her would do no good. Chasing the herd would only make it run faster. And so you're just not going to even on horseback, you are not going to outrun a herd of antelope. Judging by the landmarks, the antelope were 5 or 6 miles to the west when they turned northward. "They're making for Spirit Lake," Pa said. "They'll shelter there in the brush, and then they'll range back into the bluffs of the river. We'll not see them again." "What about Wilder's horse, Mr. Ingalls?" Cap Garland asked. Pa looked at Almanzo, and then he looked again at the northwest, and there was no cloud there, but the wind blew strongly and bitter cold. I've said this before. You have to have been out in that country to know how cold we're talking about. When they're describing, when Laura's describing this, with Pa and Almanzo as bitter cold, you just can't imagine how cold it is. And with them, it would just blow right through their clothing. It would just be like knives hitting them. Incredible, incredible cold. That's the only horse in this country that can race an antelope unless it's her mate here, and you'd kill him trying to catch them, Pa said. It's a day's journey to Spirit Lake at best, and no one knows when a blizzard hit. I wouldn't risk it myself, not this winter. I don't intend to, said Almanzo, but I'll circle around and come into town from the north. Maybe I'll catch sight of the mare, and if not, maybe she'll find her own way back. So long, I'll see you in town. He let Prince go into a canter and set off toward the north while the others shouldered their guns and turned straight toward town. He rode with his head bowed against the wind. On each prairie swell or high snowbank, he looked over the land before him. There was nothing to be seen but gentle slopes of snow and the snow spray blown from their tops by the cutting wind. The loss of Lady made him sick at heart, but he did not intend to risk his life for a horse. The match team was ruined without her. In a lifetime, he would not find another perfect match for Prince. He thought what a fool he'd been to lend a horse to a stranger. Prince went on smoothly, head up to the wind, galloping up the slopes and cantering down them. Almanzo did not intend to go far from town, but the sky remained clear in the northwest, and there was always another slope ahead of him from which he might see farther north. Lady, he thought, might have grown tired and dropped behind the antelope herd. She might be wandering, lost and bewildered. She might be in sight from the top of the next prairie swell. When he reached it, there was only the white land beyond. Prince went smoothly down the slope, and another one rose before him. He looked back to see the town, and there was no town. The huddle of tall, false fronts and the thin smoke blowing from their stovepipes had vanished. Under the whole sky, there was nothing but the white land, the snow blowing, and the wind and the cold. He was not afraid. He knew where the town was, and as long as the sun was in the sky or the moon or stars, he could not be lost. But he had a feeling colder than the wind. He felt that he was the only life on the cold earth under the cold sky, he and his horse alone in an enormous coldness. "Yip, Prince," he said, but the wind carried away the sound and the ceaseless rush of its blowing. Then he was afraid of being afraid. He said to himself, there's nothing to be afraid of. He thought, I won't turn back now. I'll turn back from the top of that next slope, and he tightened the reins ever so little to hold the rhythm of Prince's galloping. And from the top of that slope, he saw a low edge of a cloud on the northwestern skyline, and then suddenly the whole great prairie seemed to be a trap that knew it had caught him. But he also saw Lady. Far away and small on the ridge of the rolling snowfields, the brown horse stood looking eastward. Almanzo tore off his glove and putting 2 fingers into his mouth, he blew the piercing whistle used to call Lady across his father's pastures in Minnesota when she was a colt. But this prairie wind caught the shrill note at his lips and carried it soundlessly away. It carried away the long, whickering call from Prince's stretched throat. Lady stood still, looking away from them. Then she turned to look southward, and she saw them. The wind brought her far, faint whinny. Her neck arched, her tail curved up, and she came galloping. Almanzo waited until she topped a nearer rise, called her again, and came down the wind. Called her name again, and her call came down the wind. He turned then and rode toward the town. The low cloud fell behind the skyline as he rode, but again and again a lady appeared behind him. In the stable behind the feed store, he put Prince in his stall and rubbed him down. He filled the manger and held the water pail to let Prince drink a little. There was a rattling at the stable door, and he opened it to let Lady in. She was white with lather. A foam of sweat dripped from her and her sides were heaving. Almanzo shut the stable door against the cold while Lady went into her stall. Then with the curry comb he scraped the foam from her panting sides and her flanks and covered her warmly with a blanket. He squeezed a wet cloth into her mouth to moisten her tongue. He rubbed her slender legs and dried them where the sweat still ran down. Well, lady, you can outrun an antelope. You made a fool of yourself, didn't you? Almanzo talked to her while he worked. That's the last time I'll let a fool ride you anyway. Now you rest warm and quiet, and I'll water and feed you after a while. That must have been a huge moment for him to get this horse back. And these, Almanzo's horses were a part of his identity. They were part of his essence. And so the thought of losing one of these animals, one of his horses, his beloved, beautifully trained horses, would have been devastating for him. But he also knew that, he loved this horse and prized this horse. He wasn't going to risk his life for the horse. But you can get another horse. You can't get your own life back if you make a bad mistake. So he handled it well. I think Almanzo shows that he's thoughtful and realistic about where he and his horses and his life works. He knows the balance of priorities is really important. Pa had come quietly into the kitchen, and without a word he laid his shotgun on its hooks. No one said anything. There was no need to. Carrie sighed. There would be no venison, no gravy on the brown bread. Pa sat down by the stove and spread his hands to the warmth. After a little he said, Foster lost his head from excitement. He jumped off his horse and fired before he had anywhere near within gunshot. None of the rest of us had a chance. The whole herd's hightailed it north. Ma put a stick of hay on the stove. Well, they would have been poor eating anyway this time of year, she said. Laura knew that the antelope had to paw away the deep snow to reach the dry grass that was their food. In a blizzard, they couldn't do that, and now the snow was so deep that they must be starving. It was true that their meat would have been thin and tough, but it would have been meat. They were all so tired of nothing but potatoes and brown bread. The younger, wilder boy's horse got away too, Pa said, and he told them how it had run with the antelope. He made a story for Carrie and Grace of the beautiful horse running free and far with the wild herd. And didn't it ever come back, Pa? Grace asked him, wide-eyed. Well, I don't know, said Pa. Almanzo Wilder rode off that way, and I don't know whether he's come back or not. While you're getting dinner ready, Caroline, I'll step up to the feed store and find out. The feed store was bare and empty, but Royal looked from the back room and said heartily, well, come on in, Mr. Ingalls. You're just in time to sample the pancakes and bacon. I didn't know this was your dinner time, Pa said. He looked at the platter of bacon keeping hot on the stove hearth. 3 stacks of pancakes were tall on the plate, too, and Royal was frying more. There was molasses on the table, and the coffee pot was boiling. Well, we eat when we get hungry, said Royal. That's the advantage of batching it. Where there's no women folks, there's no regular meal times. Well, you boys are lucky to have brought in supplies, Pa said. Well, I was bringing out a carload to feed anyway, and I thought I might as well bring stuff along, Royal replied. I wish I'd brought a couple of carloads now. I guess I could sell another carload before they get the train through. I guess you could, Pa agreed. He looked around the snug room and ran his eyes along the walls hung with clothes and harness and noticed the empty spaces at the end wall. Your brother not back yet? He just came into the stable, Royal answered. Then he exclaimed, Jiminy Crickets, look there. They saw a lady dripping with lather and empty saddled streaking past the window to the stable. While they were talking about the hunt and Mr. Foster's crazy shot, Almanzo came in. He dumped the saddles in the corner to be cleaned before he hung them up and warmed himself by the stove. Then he and Royal urged Pa to sit up to the table and eat with them. Royal don't make as good pancakes as I do, Almanzo said, but nobody can beat his bacon. It's home cured and hickory smoked from corn fattened young hogs raised on clover back on the farm in Minnesota. Sit right up here, Mr. Ingalls, and help yourself. There's plenty more down cellar in a teacup, said Royal. So Pa did. The hard winter. So, boy, at the end of that chapter, you find out where the Ingalls are down to virtually nothing. Almanzo and Royal Wilder have lots of supplies, and they're being very careful with them. But they are sharing a meal with Mr. Ingalls here, and they're going to share more, as we're going to find out in this chapter, The Hard Winter. The sun shone again next morning, and the winds were still. The day seemed warmer than it was because the sunshine was so bright. This is a beautiful day, Ma said at breakfast, but Pa shook his head. The sun's too bright, he said. I'll get a load of hay as soon as I can, for we'll need plenty on hand if another storm comes. And he hurried away. Anxiously from time to time, Ma or Laura or Carrie peeped out through the frosty window to see the northwestern sky. The sun was still shining when Pa came safely back, and after the day's second meal of brown bread and potatoes, he went across the street to hear the news. In a little while, he came gaily whistling through the front room and burst into the kitchen singing out, "Guess what I got?" Grace and Carrie ran to feel the package he carried. It feels like, Carrie said, but she did not quite dare say what it felt like for fear she'd be mistaken. "It's beef," Pa said. 4 pounds of beef to go with our bread and potatoes. He handed the package to Ma. "Charles, however did you get beef?" Ma asked, as if she could not believe it. "Foster butchered his oxen," Pa answered. "I got there just in time. Every last bit to bones and gristle sold 25 cents a pound, but I got 4 pounds and here it is, and now we'll live like kings." Ma quickly took the paper off the meat. "I'll sear it over well and pot roast it," she said. Looking at it made Laura's mouth water. She swallowed and asked, "Can you make a gravy, Ma, with water and brown flour?" "Indeed I can," Ma smiled. "We can make this last a week, for flavoring at least, and by that time the train will surely come, won't it?" She looked, smiling, at Pa, and then she stopped smiling and quietly asked, "What is it, Charles?" "Well," Pa answered reluctantly, "I hate to tell you." He cleared his throat. "The train isn't coming." They all stood looking at him. He went on, "The railroad has stopped running trains till spring." Ma threw up her hands and dropped into a chair. "How can it, Charles? It can't do that till spring. This is only the 1st of January. "They can't get the trains through," said Pa. "They no sooner get a train through a cut than a blizzard comes and snows it in again. They've got 2 trains between here and Tracy, snowed under between cuts. Every time they cleared a cut, they threw up the snow on both sides, and now all the cuts are packed full of snow to the top of the snowbanks, and at Tracy, the superintendent ran out of patience." "Patience?" Ma exclaimed. "Patience? What's his patience got to do with it What's his patience got to do with it, I'd like to know. He knows we're out here without supplies. How does he think we're going to live till spring? It isn't his business to be patient. It's his business to run the trains." "Now, Caroline," Pa said. He put his hand on her shoulder, and she stopped rocking and rolling her hands in her apron. "We haven't had a train for more than a month, and we're getting along all right," he told her. "Yes," Ma said. "There's only this month, and February is a short month, and March will be spring," Pa encouraged her. Laura looked at the 4 pounds of beef. She thought of the few potatoes left, and she saw the partly filled sack of wheat standing in the corner. "Is there any more wheat, Pa?" she asked in a low voice. "I don't know, Laura," Pa said strangely, "but don't worry. I bought a full bushel, and it's by no means gone." Laura could not help asking, "Pa, You couldn't shoot a rabbit? Pa sat down before the open oven and settled Grace on his knee. Come here, Half Pint, he said. You too, Carrie. I'm going to tell you a story. He did not answer Laura's question. She knew what the answer was. There was not a rabbit left in all that country. They must have gone south when the birds went. Pa never took his gun with him when he was hauling hay, and he would have taken it if he had ever seen so much as one rabbit's track. He put his arm around her, and she stood close against Carrie on his knee. Grace cuddled in his other arm and laughed when his brown beard tickled her face as it used to tickle Laura's when she was little. They were all cozy in Pa's arms with the warmth from the oven coming out pleasantly. Now listen, Grace and Carrie and Laura, said Pa, and you too, Mary and Ma. This is a funny story. And he told them the story of the superintendent. Now, the superintendent was an Eastern man. He sat in his offices in the East and ordered the train dispatchers to keep the trains running. But the engineers reported that storms and snow stopped the trains. Snowstorms don't stop us from running trains in the East, the superintendent said. Keep the trains running in the western end of the division. That's orders. But in the West, the trains kept stopping. He had reports that the cuts were full of snow. Well, clear the cuts, he ordered. Put on extra men. Keep the trains running. Hang the costs. They put on extra men. The costs were enormous, but still the trains did not run. Then the superintendent said, I'll go out there and clear those tracks myself. What those men need is someone to show them how we do things in the East. So he came out to Tracy in his special car, and he got off there in his city clothes and his gloves and his fur-lined coat, and this is what he said. I've come out to take charge myself, he said. I'll show you how to keep these trains running. In spite of that, he was not a bad fellow when you knew him. He rode out on the work train to the big cut west of Tracy, and he piled out in the snow with the work crew and gave his orders like any good foreman. He moved that snow up out of the cut in double quick time, and in a couple of days, the track was clear. That shows you how to do it, he said. Now run the train through tomorrow and keep it running. But that night, a blizzard hit Tracy. His special train couldn't run in that blizzard, and when it stopped blowing, the cut was packed full of snow to the top of the snowbanks he'd thrown up on both sides. He got right out there with the men again, and again they cleared the cut. It took longer that time because they had to move more snow, but he got the work train through just in time to be snowed under by the next blizzard. You had to admit that superintendent had stick-to-itiveness. He tackled the cut again and got it cleared again, and then he sat in Tracy through another blizzard, and this time he ordered 2 fresh work crews and 2 locomotives with a snow plow. He rode out to the Tracy cut on the first locomotive. The cut rose up like a hill now. Between the snowbanks that he'd thrown up on both sides of them, the blizzard had packed earth and snow, frozen solid, 100 feet deep, tapering off for a quarter of a mile. There are some amazing pictures. I'm trying to think of where I went. And this is when we were researching. We were researching for a package of DVD bonus content called Laura's Long Winters. And I think maybe it was Tracy. There's a museum, a railroad museum in a little community, and I don't remember if it was Tracy now. But the pictures of trains buried in 10 feet, 12 feet, 20 feet of snow are all over this museum. And without the proper equipment, without breaks between the blizzards, it just would have been impossible to keep the trains running. And snow was incredibly thick, and they're great pictures, and I've got them somewhere. Unfortunately, I can't show them to you now, but trust me, they're great pictures. And the snow was really deep. All right, boys, he said, we'll clear her out with picks and shovels till we can run the snow plows through. He kept at it double quick and double pay for 2 days. There was still about 12 feet of snow on the tracks, but he had learned something. He knew he would be lucky to get 3 clear days between blizzards. So on the third morning, he was going to run the snowplows through. He gave his orders to the 2 locomotive engineers. They coupled the locomotives together with the snowplow in front and ran the work train out to the cut. The 2 work crews piled out, and in a couple of hours of fast work, they had moved another couple of feet of snow. Then the superintendent stopped the work. Now, he ordered the engineers, you boys back down the track a full 2 miles and come ahead from there with all the steam pressure you've got. With 2 miles to get up to speed, you ought to hit this cut at 40 miles an hour and go through her clean as a whistle. The engineers climbed into their locomotives. Then the man on the front engine got down again. The men of the work crews were standing around in the snow, stamping their feet and beating their hands to keep warm. They crowded in to hear what the engineer was going to say, but he walked up to the superintendent and said it just the same. I quit, he said. I've been driving a locomotive for 15 years and no man can call me a coward, but I'm not taking any orders to commit suicide. You want to send a locomotive up against a 10 foot of frozen snow at 40 miles an hour, Mr. Superintendent? You can get some other man to drive it. I quit right here and now. Pa paused and Carrie said, I don't blame him. I do, said Laura. He oughtn't to quit. He ought to figure out some other way to get through if he thinks that way won't work. I think he was scared. Well, even if he was scared, Mary said, he ought to do what he was told. The superintendent must know best what to do, or how would he be the superintendent? Well, he doesn't know best, Laura contradicted, or he'd be keeping the train running. Go on, Pa, go on, Grace begged. Please, Grace, Ma said. Please, said Grace. Go on, Pa. What happened next? Yes, Pa, what did the superintendent do then? Mary asked. He fired him? He fired him, said Laura. Didn't he, Pa? Pa went on. The superintendent looked at that engineer, and he looked at the men standing around listening, and he said, I've driven a locomotive in my time, and I don't order any man to do anything I won't do myself. I'll take that throttle. He climbed up into the locomotive, and he set her in reverse, and the 2 locomotives backed off down the track. The superintendent kept them backing for a good 2 long miles, till they looked smaller than your thumb far down the track. Then he signaled with the whistle to the engineer behind, and they both put on steam power. Those locomotives came charging down that 2 miles of straight track with wide open throttles, full speed ahead, coming faster every second. Black plumes of coal smoke rolling away far behind them, headlights glaring bigger than the sunshine, wheels blurring faster and faster, roaring up to 50 miles an hour, they hit that frozen snow. What happened then, Pa? Carrie asked, breathless. Then up rose a mountain of flying snow that fell in chunks for 40 yards around. For a minute or two, no one saw anything clear. Nobody knew what had happened. But when the men came running to find out, there was the second locomotive buried halfway in the snow and the engineer crawling out of its hind end. He was considerably shaken up, but not hurt badly enough to mention. Where's the superintendent? What happened to him? They asked the engineer. All he said was, how the dickens do I know? All I know is I'm not killed. I wouldn't do that again, he said, not for $1 million in gold. The foremen were shouting to the men to come in with their picks and shovels. They dug the snow loose from around the second engine and shoveled it away. The engineer backed it out and down the track out of the way, while the men dug furiously into the snow ahead to come to that first engine and the superintendent. In hardly any time at all, they struck solid ice. See, that first locomotive had run full speed head on into that snow, its full length. It was hot with speed and steam, and it melted the snow all around it. And then the snow water froze solid in the frozen snow. And there sat the superintendent, madder than a hornet, inside the locomotive, frozen solid in a cake of ice. As you can see the men gathered round, and they're with picks and shovels trying to dig that first engine out of the snow. Grace and Carrie and Laura laughed out loud. Even Ma smiled. That Poor man, Mary said. I don't think that's funny. I do, said Laura. I guess now he doesn't think he knows so much. Pride goes before a fall, said Ma. Go on, Pa, please, Carrie begged. Did they dig him out? Yes, they dug down and cracked the ice and broke a hole through it to the engine, and they hauled him out. He was not hurt, and neither was the locomotive. The snowplow had taken the brunt. The superintendent climbed out of the cut and walked back to the second engineer and said, Can you back her out? The engineer said he thought so. All right, do it, the superintendent said. He stood watching till they got the engine out, and then he said to the men, Pile in, we're going back to Tracy, work shut down till spring. You see, girls, said Pa, the trouble is he didn't have enough patience. Nor perseverance, said Ma. Nor perseverance, Pa agreed. Just because he couldn't get through the shovels with shovels or snowplows, he figured he couldn't get through at all, and he quit trying. Well, he's an Easterner. It takes patience and perseverance to contend with things out here in the West. When did he quit, Pa? Laura asked. This morning. The news was on the electric telegraph, and the operator at Tracy told Woodworth how it happened. Pa answered, and now I must hustle to do the chores before it's too dark. His arm tightened and gave Laura a little hugging shake before he set Carrie and Grace down from his knees. Laura knew what he meant. She was old enough now to stand by him and Ma in the hard times. She must not worry. She must be cheerful and help keep all their spirits. So when Ma began to sing softly to Grace while she undressed her for bed, Laura joined in the song. O Canaan, bright Canaan, I am bound for the... Sing, Carrie, Laura said hurriedly, so Carrie began to sing. Then Mary's sweet soprano came in. On Jordan's stormy banks I stand and cast a wishful eye on Canaan's bright and shining strand, where my possessions lie. O Canaan, bright Canaan, I am bound for the happy land of Canaan. The sun was setting so red that it colored the frosted window panes. It gave a faintly rosy light to the kitchen where they all sat undressing and singing by the warm stove. But Laura thought there was a change in the sound of the wind, a wild and frightening note. After Ma had seen them all tucked into bed and had gone downstairs, they heard and felt the blizzard strike the house. Huddled close together and shivering under the covers, they listened to it. Laura thought of the lost and lonely houses, each one alone and blind and cowering in the fury of the storm. There were houses in town, but not even light from one of them could reach another, and the town was all alone on the frozen, endless prairie where snow drifted and winds howled and the whirling blizzard put out the stars and the sun. Laura tried to think of the good brown smell and taste of the beef for dinner tomorrow, but she could not forget that now the houses and the town would be all alone till spring. There was half a bushel of wheat that they could grind to make flour, and there were the few potatoes, but nothing more to eat until the train came, and the wheat and the potatoes were not enough. And that's the end of our second chapter for today. I just remember when I read this book for the first time years ago, I was just struck by how desperate their situation was. And there's nobody to turn to. I mean, there are a few people in town, and people are going to help each other. And those of you who know the story know that people are going to help each other. But there is no help from the outside. Anything that they're going to do to survive is going to come from what they've got around them right now, or what they can search for and find down the line. Today, all I can say, aren't we grateful that we have? I hope everybody has. When it's cold, I hope everyone has heat and they can close their windows and stay warm and put on something warm. We can be grateful that we have those those comforts today as we face the challenges that we face. You know, with global warming, it's maybe not, the winters aren't as cold, although we certainly have very cold times that happen all over the country and certainly around the world. But to read it the way Laura writes it, it's just endless, bitter, devastating cold, and there's no relief, and no one can save them but themselves. We'll see how they do when we continue tomorrow with the long winter. It'll be Sunday, June 7th, and I look forward to seeing you then. In the meantime, have a great day. Be safe. Wash your hands. Wear your masks. Practice your social distancing, and stay warm, or stay cool if you're really hot. We'll see you tomorrow. Have a good day. Bye-bye.